Have you ever wondered why we always want just a little bit more? A little more money, a little more love, a little more recognition. As if somewhere, just around the next corner, lies the thing that will finally make us whole. And yet the moment we get what we crave, it slips through our fingers. A new phone, a dream vacation, even a soulmate. What once shimmered like gold starts to feel ordinary, so we chase again. It's like drinking salt water, hoping it will quench our thirst, only to find ourselves more parched than before. This is not a modern problem. It's not a Western problem. It's a human problem. And the Buddha saw it clearly over 2,500 years ago. He called it tanha, craving, thirst, that burning ache in the heart that says, "This isn't enough. I'm not enough. I need more." And this thirst doesn't care how much you already have. It doesn't care if you're rich, successful, admired, or even deeply loved. It will whisper, "Just one more thing, then you'll finally be okay." But that day never comes, because craving doesn't want you to be satisfied. It wants you to keep running. We live in a world that fuels this illusion. Ads tell us happiness is only one purchase away. Social media bombards us with highlight reels of other people's lives, edited, filtered, perfected. The result? We spend our days scrolling, comparing, desiring, rarely pausing to ask, what if I already have enough? What if contentment isn't something we find by chasing more, but something we awaken by needing less? You see, most of us are not truly poor in possessions. We're poor in peace, poor in stillness, poor in enough. That's why the old Buddhist saying strikes so deep. Contentment is wealth, not because it makes you richer in the eyes of the world, but because it sets you free from the prison of never-ending hunger. Let's tell the truth. We've all had moments when we thought, if I just get this one thing, then I'll finally be happy. And maybe it did bring a spark, a rush, a thrill, but like every firework, it fades. And then we search for the next high, the next distraction, the next goal, person, achievement, possession. Each time we believe it will be the answer. Each time we're left with the same quiet emptiness, an emptiness that no amount of more can ever fill. Because it's not an emptiness of things, it's the emptiness of meaning. And meaning can't be bought. It must be uncovered beneath the noise. Somewhere inside us we know this. We've glimpsed it in moments of silence, in a simple meal shared without distraction, in a quiet walk through the woods, in the feeling of watching the sun rise without a single thought of gaining or achieving, just being. That is contentment, not excitement, not achievement, not pleasure, but the deep, unshakable joy of knowing you are enough and life is enough right now. So, what keeps us from living that way? Why do we run, even when we're tired of running? Because the illusion of more is seductive. It promises escape from boredom, pain, insecurity, loneliness. But in truth, it only deepens those wounds. And yet, no one teaches us how to stop, how to sit with ourselves, how to find satisfaction not in what we gain, but in what we release. That's where this journey begins, not in condemning desire, but in understanding it. Not in becoming monks or giving up the world, but in learning how to walk through it with clarity, balance, and peace. This isn't a call to poverty, it's a call to freedom. Because when you stop chasing more, you start discovering what you truly have and what you truly are. It begins as a whisper, a silent tug in the mind that says, if only I had that, I'd be happy. It could be something small, your favorite dessert, a compliment, an extra hour of sleep. Or something bigger, a promotion, a lover, a new life somewhere far from here. At first it feels innocent, a flicker of desire, a wish. But desire, when left unchecked, doesn't stay a flicker, it becomes a fire. And once that fire catches, it burns through everything. Logic, contentment, peace. It convinces us that happiness is always out there, just beyond reach. And so, we chase. But here's the part no one tells us. Every craving is a contract with suffering. Because even when we get what we want, we become afraid of losing it, or we find that it wasn't what we thought. Or worse, we want something more right after. Like a hamster on a wheel, we keep running, thinking the next spin will take us somewhere. But it only brings us back to where we started, tired, empty, still craving. The Buddha didn't condemn desire to make us feel guilty. He exposed it to set us free. He saw how craving, tanha, isn't just wanting, it's thirsting. A kind of hunger that distorts reality and drags us into the cycle he called samsara, the endless wandering through birth, decay, sorrow, and death. Not just literally, but emotionally. We are reborn every day in the fire of wanting. We suffer because we grasp for what's pleasurable and resist what's painful, always swinging between chasing and running, never resting. And in that pendulum swing, we miss the stillness. We forget how to be. Think of the last time you were obsessed with getting something. Maybe it was someone's approval. Maybe it was a new possession. Maybe it was revenge. In that moment, didn't everything else fade? Your peace, your presence, your joy. Craving narrows our world. It shrinks our field of vision until all we see is what we lack. And what we lack becomes our God. We kneel to it. We sacrifice for it. We suffer for it. All for a reward that's fleeting at best and illusion at worst. But here's the most dangerous part of craving. It never ends. Fulfilled desire is not a conclusion. It's a trigger. The moment one craving is satisfied, the mind creates another. That's how it survives, by keeping us in motion. And so, desire becomes the architect of its own misery. The Buddha likened it to a person wounded by an arrow who, rather than pulling it out, asks, "Who shot it? What kind of wood is it made of? What feathers does it have?" Meanwhile, they continue to bleed. Craving wounds us. But instead of healing, we ask, "What can I acquire next?" And in doing so, we keep the arrow lodged deep in our hearts. So what's the way out? It begins with seeing, not resisting desire with force. Not shaming ourselves for wanting, but simply becoming aware. When craving arises, pause, don't feed it, don't fight it, just observe. Watch how it moves, how it seduces, how it lies. The moment we see craving for what it is, a trickster cloaked in promises, its power begins to dissolve. Because craving depends on your ignorance. It needs you to believe that happiness is outside you. But the moment you turn inward, it starts to die. This is the first crack in the wall, the first breath of air in a room long sealed shut. It may seem small, but it is everything. Because once you begin to see the cycle, you're no longer blindly spinning in it. You start to step out. And that step is not just psychological, it's spiritual. It's the beginning of liberation. Most people live their entire lives chasing pleasures and avoiding pain, never realizing that both are traps when pursued blindly. But there is another way, a quieter path, a middle path, where joy is not chased but uncovered, where peace is not bought but remembered, where desire is not the master but the lesson. We'll walk that path together, but first we must face a deeper truth. That real poverty is not a lack of wealth. It is the inability to be content. And in that truth lies the wisdom that changed the course of human awakening. Most people think of poverty as the absence of money, no house, no possessions, no power. But what if true poverty isn't about what you don't have? It's about what you can't stop needing. That's what the Buddha saw long before modern psychology or economics. He wasn't concerned with how full your pockets were. He was concerned with how empty your heart had become from never being able to say, enough. It's a radical idea even now, because we've been trained to measure wealth in things, net worth, salary, cars, status. But the Buddha flipped the equation. A person who is content is rich. A person who craves is poor. no matter how much they own. Imagine that. A beggar who sleeps peacefully under a tree may be wealthier than a billionaire tormented by fear, greed, and anxiety. Because the first has enough, while the second doesn't even know what enough means. Think of desire as a bottomless cup. No matter how much you pour into it, it never fills. You keep adding more, hoping this next thing, this next win will finally do the trick. But the cup has no bottom, it just keeps leaking. And so we hustle harder, work longer, scroll further, chase faster, not realizing the real solution isn't to pour more in. It's to see that the cup is broken. There's a story in Buddhist tradition that goes like this. A poor man lived in misery, begging every day for food. He envied the rich and resented the world. One day, a monk passed by and smiled at him. The man snarled, "What do you know about suffering?" The monk replied gently, "You're sitting on gold, but you don't know it." Confused and angry, the man dismissed him. Years passed. The man died in poverty. Later, when the land was dug for construction, people discovered a treasure chest buried beneath where he used to sit every day. He had been sitting on wealth the whole time, unaware. This is the tragedy of human desire. We search everywhere. We grasp at pleasures, chase identities, cling to hopes, all while sitting on the deepest treasure of all, inner peace. But because we're so distracted by the glitter of more, we never look down to see the gold already beneath our feet. The Buddha knew this. That's why he didn't teach people how to get what they want. He taught them how to stop needing so much. He didn't promise you'll always be happy. He promised that if you can uproot craving, you will no longer be owned by suffering. This is true spiritual wealth. The kind no market crash can take. The kind no thief can steal. The kind that doesn't fade with age or beauty or applause. It is the wealth of enoughness. But here's the hard part. The world won't validate that kind of wealth. It won't give you trophies for stillness. It won't praise your ability to be satisfied with less. You won't trend on social media for walking away from what everyone else is chasing. But in the stillness of your own heart, you'll know the freedom of not needing to impress, the peace of not being pushed by craving, the richness of waking up and thinking, I already have what matters. When you hear desire is the root of suffering, it might sound harsh. But the Buddha wasn't condemning your humanity. He was offering a medicine. Because when you loosen your grip on desire, desire loosens its grip on you. And for the first time you can breathe. You can be. You can walk through life without feeling like something is always missing. That, my friend, is wealth. And it's available to anyone. Not by reaching for more, but by seeing more clearly. Sometimes, to understand how rich you truly are, you have to stop counting what you've gained and start noticing what you no longer need. What if the answer to a complicated life isn't more control, more goals, more upgrades, but simply less noise, less clutter, less craving, not because life is meant to be small, but because what's essential is often buried beneath what's excessive. The Buddha knew this. After years of wealth and luxury, he gave it all up in search of truth. But when he nearly starved himself in severe self-denial, he realized something profound. Neither indulgence nor self-torture leads to peace. And in that moment, a new path was born. The middle way. A way that doesn't reject the world but doesn't get lost in it either. A way that embraces balance over extremes. Clarity over chaos, contentment over consumption. It's not a path of poverty, it's a path of simplicity, but in a world obsessed with more. Simplicity can feel like rebellion. You're told to maximize, optimize, accumulate, display. From the clothes you wear to the home you live in, from your career to your social feed, everything whispers the same message. You're not enough until you have more, so we hustle, we spend, we compare. And slowly we drown in the very things we thought would save us. But here's the truth that many never dare to live. Simplicity doesn't take anything from you. It gives everything back. Your time, your clarity, your peace. When you begin to subtract what's unnecessary, you rediscover what's sacred. Like a sculptor who carves away the stone, not to destroy, but to reveal the beauty hidden inside. Living simply isn't about renouncing life. It's about realigning with life. It's about asking questions like, do I really need this, or am I just trying to impress? Is this bringing me peace or just keeping me busy? What would happen if I stopped chasing and started listening? You begin to see that much of what we call needs are just habits of craving dressed up in urgency. And once you pause long enough to notice, you're no longer controlled by them. There's a quiet kind of power in simplicity, a cup of tea enjoyed in stillness, a walk without a destination, a moment of silence that doesn't beg to be filled. These things may look small, but they carry a depth that the loudest achievements never touch. Because in simplicity, we return to what's real. We begin to live deliberately, not as consumers, not as performers, but as humans awake to each breath, each step, each moment. Many spiritual masters, monks, and sages have lived with little, but what they gave up in possessions, they gained tenfold in peace, presence, and joy. Their lives teach us something priceless, that when your inner world is full, you no longer need to decorate the outside, because simplicity is not lack, it's freedom from excess, freedom from the constant noise that says, buy more, do more, be more. When you choose simplicity, you finally hear another voice, the quiet one within you that whispers, this is enough. The middle way is not a tightrope, it's a grounded path. It doesn't ask you to abandon pleasure or embrace pain. It invites you to walk through life lightly, with eyes open and heart clear, to enjoy what you have without clinging, to let go of what you don't without regret. And in doing so, you begin to touch the joy that doesn't depend on anything outside of you. A joy born not from adding more to life, but from removing what never belonged in the first place. Sometimes, peace isn't something we have to search for. It's simply what remains when we stop chasing everything else. Sometimes, wisdom doesn't arrive through lectures or scriptures. Sometimes it comes wrapped in the quiet lives of those who have dared to live differently. You see, contentment is not a theory. It's not a slogan. It's a lived truth, written in the footsteps of monks, wanderers, sages, and even ordinary people who chose peace over possession. Let me tell you a few stories. There was once a monk who lived deep in the forest. His robe was tattered, his bowl chipped, his hut no bigger than a closet. A rich merchant traveled for days just to meet him. When he arrived, he was baffled. He asked, "Venerable sir, where are your belongings, your comforts?" The monk simply smiled. "Where are yours?" The merchant said, "Oh, I'm just passing through." The monk looked into his eyes and replied, "So am I." Another story comes from Japan. A Zen master was invited to speak at a university. He wore no formal clothes, carried no credentials, and when he entered the lecture hall, he bowed and sat silently. Minutes passed. Students began whispering, "Was this a joke?" Then finally, he spoke just one sentence. "The less I own, the more space I have to sit with life." Then he stood up, bowed again, and left. That was the whole talk. No PowerPoint, no quotes, no applause, just presence. And for those who truly listened, that single sentence said more than 1,000 books. But contentment isn't only found in monks and mystics. Sometimes, it's hidden in the quiet corners of modern life. A woman in New York left a 6-figure job to open a tiny tea shop. People thought she'd lost her mind. But she said, "I used to collect paychecks. Now I collect mornings without anxiety." A man in Mumbai gave away most of his possessions. No tragedy, no crisis. He just said, I was tired of organizing things I didn't care about. He lives in a one-room apartment now, but says it feels like a palace because it holds nothing that drains his soul. In a world that celebrates more, these people chose less, not because they had to, but because they could, because they realized that chasing more was costing them the one thing they could never get back: presence, time with loved ones, stillness in the morning, freedom to breathe without pressure to perform. You see, contentment doesn't mean you give up ambition. It means you no longer let ambition steal your peace. It's not about shrinking your life. It's about deepening it. There's a kind of richness that doesn't show up in your bank account. It shows up in your nervous system, in your relationships, in the way your eyes soften when you speak to the world. Not with hunger, but with appreciation. The Buddha didn't say contentment was for monks only. He offered it to everyone. From kings to servants, merchants to farmers, parents to wanderers. Because the treasure of enough is not owned. It's realized. And once you realize it, you no longer envy. You no longer chase shadows. You walk through the world lightly, like someone who carries nothing. Because they lack nothing, these stories aren't instructions, they're mirrors. Reflections of what's possible when we stop trying to impress the world and start listening to the whisper of our own heart, a whisper that says, I'm already full, I just forgot. And maybe, just maybe, you don't need to move to the forest or give everything away. To touch that same quiet joy, maybe it's already within reach, waiting for you to slow down, to let go, and to remember that peace doesn't live in what you possess. It lives in how you relate to what you don't. It's easy to speak of contentment as a beautiful idea, a poetic vision of peace and simplicity. But how do we live it? Not on a mountain, not in a monastery, but in the middle of real life, with deadlines, family noise, social pressure, and the endless buzz of a world that never sleeps. Can we practice contentment there, right in the heart of it all? The answer is yes, but not by force, and not by waiting for life to be perfect. We begin exactly where we are. The first step is deceptively simple. Pause, before buying, before replying, before scrolling, before wanting more. Just pause, a few seconds of stillness, a conscious breath, a quiet check-in. Am I acting from fullness or from lack? Most of the time, we don't choose discontent. We just move too fast to notice it. Contentment doesn't require changing your life overnight. It asks you to slow down enough to see what already brings you peace, and to stop racing past it. Step 2, name your enough. Every morning, ask yourself, what would make today enough? Maybe it's having dinner with your family without distractions. Maybe it's finishing one task, not 10. Maybe it's watching the sunset for 5 full minutes without taking a photo. By defining your enough, you reclaim your day from the impossible demands of the world. Because if you don't name it, someone else will, usually in the form of ads, algorithms, or expectations that aren't yours. Step 3, celebrate what money can't buy. We're conditioned to measure success in things we can show: a raise, a house, a number, a brand. But true richness shows up in quieter ways. The feeling of waking up without dread. The joy of laughing so hard you forget time. A moment of silence where your heart feels whole. These are treasures, and the more you notice them, the less you chase things that never truly satisfy. Step 4, practice sacred subtraction. We often ask, what can I add to feel better? But the better question is, what can I remove to feel lighter? Maybe it's one app that steals your peace. Maybe it's a toxic comparison you revisit every morning. Maybe it's a routine that looks productive but leaves you drained. Contentment is not passive. It's intentional. It means choosing to clear the path, so joy doesn't have to fight its way through the clutter. Step 5, Embrace the joy of just this. Try this simple practice. Once a day, choose a small moment and give it your full, undivided presence. Just this cup of tea, just this breath, just this sunset, just this smile. No multitasking. No planning, no fixing. Let it be enough. You'll be surprised how deep something becomes when you stop trying to rush past it. Step 6. End your day with gratitude, not goals. Before sleep, don't ask, did I accomplish enough? Ask, what did I receive today that didn't cost a thing? A kind word, a deep inhale, the feeling of your body resting in bed after a long day. Gratitude isn't just polite, it's powerful. It turns ordinary moments into sacred ones. It rewires the mind from lack to love. And finally, remember, contentment is not the absence of desire. It's the wisdom to know which desires are worth keeping and which ones are quietly destroying your peace. You don't have to give up your dreams. You don't have to live like a monk, but you can learn to desire more mindfully, to buy more consciously, to live more gently, not because you have to, but because you want to feel alive in a way the world can't sell you. At the end of the day, contentment is not a place you reach. It's a way you walk, and each time you pause, breathe, and choose enough over more, you're already walking it, one breath, one moment, one quiet, sacred step at a time. There's a lie that's quietly woven into modern life, a whisper repeated so often we stop questioning it. If you slow down, you'll fall behind. If you stop chasing, you're giving up. If you're content, you're lazy. But what if the opposite is true? What if contentment isn't a retreat from life, but the deepest way to master it? What if slowing down isn't weakness, but the highest form of wisdom? We live in a culture that worships hustle. Grind now, rest later. Never settle. Outwork the competition. Ambition has become a religion. Rest, a sin. Satisfaction, a threat. But the Buddha saw this madness long before the modern world was built. He didn't condemn effort. He condemned craving. He didn't reject goals. He rejected attachment to them. You see, effort driven by clarity is strength. Effort driven by craving is suffering. Contentment is not sitting back and doing nothing. It's doing what matters most with full presence, without being possessed by the outcome. It's the farmer who plants his seeds and lets the rain fall as it may. The musician who plays from the heart, not for applause. The parent who loves without needing to control. It takes great strength to live this way, because contentment requires something far harder than ambition. It demands surrender. Surrendering the illusion that you are only as valuable as your achievements. Surrendering the lie that more always means better. Surrendering the noise so you can hear what really matters. People often confuse settling with contentment. They're not the same. Settling is resignation. Contentment is liberation. Settling says, I guess this is all I get. Contentment says, this moment is already full. Settling gives up on growth. Contentment grows inward. True contentment doesn't mean you stop improving. It means you stop being at war with yourself while you improve. Think of the wisest people in history. Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Thich Nhat Hanh. They weren't passive. They weren't unmotivated. They were powerful because they had nothing to prove. And that, ironically, made them unstoppable. When you're not chasing validation, you move from a place of deep internal power, not the power of control, but the power of alignment. A content person doesn't lack desire. They've simply refined their desires. They don't want everything. They want the right things. They know that peace is more valuable than possession. That presence is more precious than praise. And when they work, they do it not to fill a void, but to express the fullness already within. This is not laziness. This is mastery. The Buddha once said, health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth, faithfulness the best relationship. In one sentence, he rewrote the story of success, not as accumulation, but as alignment, not as endless action, but as wise stillness between the actions. The goal of spiritual life is not to escape the world, but to stop being ruled by it. That's what contentment does. Now imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning, not because your alarm screamed at you, but because your mind is rested, not with a racing checklist, but with a quiet intention. You move through the day with clarity. You work, but not in frenzy. You rest without guilt. And by night, you're not drained from chasing. You're filled by simply being. That's not laziness. That's power. We've been taught that mastery looks like control. But in truth, the highest mastery is letting go of what's not essential, of what never satisfied you anyway, and choosing moment by moment to live from within. Because once you master the art of enough, no one can manipulate you with more. When you no longer need to prove anything, you become unshakable, and that is the true wealth of the wise. Letting go. Two simple words that feel like standing at the edge of a cliff. We're told to release, to surrender, to unclench our fists and loosen our grip. But deep down, we're afraid that if we let go, everything will fall apart. That letting go means giving up on our dreams, our values, our lives. But that's not what true letting go means. Letting go isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of freedom. We've been conditioned to hold tightly to everything. Our plans, our identities, our status, our opinions, our pain. We're taught to fight for control, to hold on even when it hurts, to grip the burning rope, because at least it feels like we're doing something. But the Buddha taught something radical. You can only lose what you cling to. That includes suffering. That includes fear. That includes the version of you that no longer fits the life you're growing into. So what does it really mean to let go? It's not abandoning effort. It's abandoning attachment. It's not walking away from responsibility. It's walking away from illusion. It's not giving up on the path. It's giving up the need to control where it leads. Letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop needing others to fit your idea of love. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. Imagine a bird perched on a branch. Does it fear the branch breaking? No, because its trust isn't in the branch, but in its own wings. Letting go is just that. It's trusting that your peace doesn't come from what you hold on to, but from who you are when you finally stop grasping. And when you stop gripping the world so tightly, you find your hands are free to receive what really matters. So many of us confuse letting go with losing. We think, if I let go of my anger, I'll be weak. If I let go of that relationship, I'll be alone. If I let go of my ambition, I'll be nothing. But in truth, letting go is how we stop losing ourselves. You can let go of bitterness and still keep your boundaries. You can let go of attachment and still be deeply in love. You can let go of ego and still honor your worth. Letting go isn't erasure, it's clarity. You're not erasing the picture. You're wiping the glass so you can see it. When the Buddha left his palace, he didn't run away from life. He stepped into it fully awake. He let go of luxury, not because comfort is evil, but because attachment to it creates suffering. He didn't give up the world. He gave up the illusion that the world could satisfy the deepest thirst inside him. To let go is not to float away. It's to plant your feet firmly in what is real. You stop chasing what changes and turn toward what stays. You stop searching for perfection and start noticing the sacred in the ordinary. You stop trying to be someone else and start remembering who you already are. Letting go is not passive. It's one of the most courageous acts a person can make. It's saying, I no longer need this pain to define me. I no longer need this outcome to feel whole. I no longer need to control what I cannot hold. You give up the struggle, and in return, You gain your life back. You don't need to renounce the world to be free. You just need to stop expecting it to complete you. Let go of the chase. Let go of the scoreboard. Let go of the noise. Because the more you release, the lighter you become. And in that lightness, you rise not away from life, but into it. There's a deeper kind of power that lives on the other side of letting go. Not the power to control others, but the power to no longer be controlled. No longer manipulated by fear. No longer hijacked by craving. No longer fooled by illusion. This isn't giving up. This is waking up, when the heart is uncluttered. Even silence feels full. And when the mind is free, even a simple moment feels divine. Letting go isn't the end of your journey. It's when you finally begin walking it with both hands open. There is a joy the world doesn't talk about. It's not loud. It doesn't shine on stages. It doesn't show up in headlines, but it is real. Maybe the most real thing of all. It is the quiet, steady joy of enough. No applause. No fireworks. No dopamine rush from chasing or getting, just the soft exhale of peace. Just the stillness of knowing, I am okay. Right here, right now, just as it is. This joy doesn't demand more. It doesn't scream, what's next? It doesn't bargain with life or argue with time. It just is. And that is its power. In a world built on hunger, enough is a revolution. The advertising machine thrives on your dissatisfaction. It survives by whispering, you're missing something. You need this, you need more. And the moment you believe that lie, you enter the race, not a joyful run, but an endless aching sprint on a treadmill of craving. You run harder, you chase faster, but the finish line never comes. Because more has no ceiling. It's a hunger that feeds on itself. But enough is where that hunger finally stops. Enough is where you step off the treadmill. Place your hand on your heart and say, this moment is complete. This joy isn't taught in schools. It's not trending on social media. It doesn't sparkle like a diamond or roar like a luxury car. But it glows. It glows in the smile of a mother watching her child sleep, in the sip of hot tea on a quiet afternoon, in the shared silence between two souls who understand each other. This is wealth beyond price. And yet, it asks for nothing but your presence. The Buddha described this feeling not as an accident, but as a practice, not as resignation, but realization. The practice of contentment, santosha, in ancient teachings, isn't about settling for less. It's about seeing clearly. It's about choosing freedom over frenzy, stillness over status. You don't lose your edge. You lose your need to edge everyone else out. You don't stop growing. You stop grasping. Most people wait for life to deliver joy in packages. When I make this much money, when I travel there, when they finally love me back. But that joy is conditional, which means it's always at risk. The joy of enough. It's unconditional because it's not based on what happens. It's based on how you see. Let me tell you a story. There was once a Zen monk who owned almost nothing. A bowl, a robe, a mat to sleep on. One evening, a thief broke into his hut. Finding nothing to steal, the monk greeted him and said, "You came a long way. You shouldn't leave empty-handed." He handed the thief his robe, and as the thief ran into the night, the monk looked at the sky and whispered, "If only I could give him this beautiful moon." That's the joy of enough. No bitterness, no fear, just a heart so full it doesn't need to own to feel rich. There is a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on excitement. It's not adrenaline. It's not novelty. It's not the sugar rush of validation. It's deeper, wider, quieter. It's the joy of not needing to be more, because you've stopped believing you're not already enough. It's the smile that comes for no reason, the laugh that rises from nowhere, the tear that falls in the middle of stillness, when you realize you're finally home in yourself, in this quiet joy. You stop proving. You stop performing. You stop pretending. You don't need to convince the world of your worth. Because in the stillness of enough, you feel it without question, without doubt. This is not laziness. This is liberation, the most beautiful part. This joy is always available. You don't need to earn it. You don't need to chase it. You only need to pause, to breathe, to notice, to return to this moment, this breath, this life. It's here, it's quiet, it's enough. And in that sacred silence, you realize something you've always known, but somehow forgot. That you, just as you are, without one more achievement, one more follower, one more possession, are already complete. And so we near the end of this journey, but not the end of the wisdom. Because once you've tasted the silent joy of enough, something inside shifts forever. You can never quite go back to the noise. You don't need to escape the world, only to see it more clearly. And from that clarity, from that deep inner peace, rises the final truth we've been circling all along. So here we are, the end of a journey, but perhaps the beginning of something far more real. We've wandered through the hunger of the human mind, through the cravings that bind us, through the illusions that whisper, not yet, not enough. And slowly, step by step, we peeled back the layers of that illusion, until only something still remained. Not flashy, not loud, not made for show, but truth, simple, bare, unshakable. There is a story in the Buddhist tradition. A king once asked a monk, "What is the greatest wealth a person can possess?" The monk replied with a quiet smile, "The wealth of having nothing to lose." The king was confused, but the monk continued, "When you own nothing, nothing can own you. When you cling to nothing, nothing can control you. And when you need nothing to feel complete, you have arrived. This is not poverty, this is freedom. A richness that doesn't rust or fade because it isn't stored in vaults, it's stored in awareness, in presence, in peace. In the kind of still joy that can't be bought, only remembered. You don't have to abandon your life. You don't need to burn your possessions or walk barefoot into the forest, but you can walk lighter. You can live cleaner. You can love deeper. By learning the art of letting go without losing, of having without clinging, of living without grasping, because in the end, life isn't about what we accumulate, it's about what we awaken to. Not about how much we hold, but how deeply we see. There's a reason the Buddha smiled, not in triumph but in tenderness. He wasn't celebrating escape, he was honoring return, a return to simplicity, to clarity, to this very breath, and perhaps to the most important knowing of all, that the richest person is not the one who owns the most, but the one who needs the least. If this message has touched something in you, a still place, a quiet truth, then you already know. This isn't the end. This is the remembering of a wisdom already inside you, a voice that's always been there, soft but steady, saying you are enough, this is enough, now is enough. If this journey has resonated with you, if something in your heart felt seen or soothed, we invite you to walk a little further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, a space to breathe, to reflect, and to return again and again to the truths that truly matter, not to escape the world, but to live in it with more presence, more compassion, and more clarity, because the world doesn't need more noise, it needs more stillness. And maybe, just maybe, you're part of that stillness too. Until next time, be well, be free, be here.